Hey, this is Tony here with Salt Strong, and in this video I'm going to be giving you some tips that will help improve your hookup ratio when using weedless jig heads. I've seen a lot of questions come in with people having issues that they're missing a lot of fish, they're missing a lot of strikes, and there are a few reasons why that can happen when using a weedless jig head such as this. This is the Z-Man weedless jig head. There are some other companies out there that make them as well, but as you notice, this metal weed guard here, this is the biggest culprit when it comes to missing fish because it does cover the point of the hook. So if anything happens that keeps that wire from coming off the barb of the hook or getting stuck, that is going to lead to missed fish. So some reasons as to why that will happen is, let's say a fish strikes from the side or the hook is on its side when the fish goes to strike. If you notice, when I push that weed guard on the side, it doesn't come off the hook point. So if you have a fish that just happens to strike this hook from the side, it grabs it and it doesn't allow that weed guard to come off, you're gonna miss that fish. So that's just one of the big cons about this, and there are some ways to kind of alter the weed guard to help alleviate that problem. So one of the biggest things I like to do is make sure the weed guard isn't rounded too much. You really don't want the weed guard to be going higher than the hook point because that requires a lot more pressure to push that weed guard off. So that will result in missed fish as well. Also, if you notice the gap between the two sides of the weed guard, if that gap is very narrow, that can also lead to missed strikes. If this metal guard is curved any, it needs to be perfectly straight, because if it's curved, what will happen is, I'll just go ahead and show you here as an example. If that weed guard is curved or it's off center, if a fish goes to strike and pushes down, that weed guard can get caught on the hook point. As you see there, I'm pushing down on it and it's not coming off. It took a lot of pressure to get that off there. So make sure your weed guard is perfectly straight, especially after fighting a fish or getting a really good strike. Make sure that weed guard is nice and straight. And you can actually pull the weed guard apart here. You can pull it apart, give it a little bit more of a gap, as you can see there. That will help it come off the hook a lot easier. It'll keep those sides from getting snagged on the hook point. So just keep that in mind as well to avoid missing strikes. Now, one last tip is to make sure that weed guard isn't all the way up past the barb of the hook there. Because what can happen if this weed guard is too straight, it can actually get stuck behind the barb of the hook. And also sometimes if a fish pushes closer to the eye of the hook, or if there's a lot of pressure closer to the eye of the hook, you can see how that weed guard extends very close to that barb of the hook. So if your hook happens to be bent a little bit, if it's pushed forward, you can see that weed guard is now stuck on the barb of that hook. So definitely make sure your weed guard doesn't get stuck there. Make sure there's enough clearance. As you can see, these hooks flex quite a bit. So if that happens, your weed guard can get stuck on that barb. So make sure your hooks are nice and straight. Make sure your weed guard is nice and straight. Make sure you pull the weed guard apart a little bit, give it more of a gap. That way it can clear the point of the hook. That way if a fish strikes, that weed guard clears the hook and the hook's exposed so you can catch that fish. Now, one last tip when you are using these weedless jig heads, as far as rigging goes with a soft plastic, make sure you're not using a soft plastic that has a very thick body, because what will happen is you'll lose clearance for that weed guard to come off. So ideally, you don't want a soft plastic that when it's rigged up on here, you don't really want it going past about halfway up the curve of the hook. So for an example here, I'll just use this. This is a Z-Man Minnow Z Slam Shady color. It's one of our custom colors here at Salt Strong. And what you can do is just make sure when your lure is set on that jig head, it's lined up right, you have enough clearance there. Again, you don't want that lure to be way up close to the hook point because it's not going to give enough clearance for that weed guard to come down. So if you have to, you can sort of rig the lure higher up on the head. Start the jig head going through higher up on the head rather than in the middle or further down. So that's just a little tip to help keep you from missing strikes when using these jig heads. Quite a few tips in here. If you have any questions or comments about it, please feel free to leave them down below. Also, you can pick up some of these on our shop page at shop.saltstrong.com. Until then, thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.